Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back. We are on kind of our second episode of this series we're going to do on Alexis de Tocqueville and democracy in America. And we decided to do this because his name keeps coming up in podcasts, and we thought it was really important. So if you haven't listened to the last episode, please do so. Dr. Beinberg kind of sets us up, why democracy in America was written and kind of gives us an overview. But today we're going to talk about Alexis de Tocqueville and Andrew Jackson and
the
Dr. Beinberg. And the Constitution. But I also just like the, not drama, but say historical drama is kind of fun. But
Yep.
Tocqueville had thoughts on Andrew Jackson. So Dr. Beinberg, can you kind of give us that overview of what Tocqueville thought of Jacksonian democracy, the Constitution, all that good stuff?
So I want to for those that either didn't read it, didn't listen to it, or have been a little while, I want to just re-flag something from the last podcast, which is Tocqueville says, when one examines the Constitution of the United States, one is frightened by the quantity of knowledge and discernment that it supposes in those whom it must rule. So he calls the Constitution at one point the most perfect of all known constitutions, but he also recognizes it's complicated. And so democracy in America has large sections. In fact, the Justice Joseph Story complains. He says, there's chunks of that book. It's just him ripping off the Federalist and my book. His story's like really prickly. He's like, this is just basically my book, which I don't think is fair because Tocqueville is actually quite explicit in giving credit. He says every person in Europe should read the Federalist Papers. He says it's the best book on political statecraft ever written. So like he's giving credit. Yeah, he's citing his sources. I think he cites Story too. He cites a bunch of people. He usually is pretty good about that. We know later on, actually, about 15 years ago, a cool book came out that was collecting all his travel journals and letters and interviews. And so it's kind of fun to see who all he talked to. He doesn't credit that many of the interviewees in the book, but he does credit the Federalist and the legal writings. He loves the Federalist Papers. There are places he thinks that they get it wrong or subsequent events have sort of disproven it. But as a fundamental, he's smitten with them. And many of, I think, some of the, not the best parts of Tocqueville, but when I'm doing an Intro to American Civics class, I will often assign Tocqueville because in some places he's actually clearer and easier in explaining the logic of the Federalist Papers than the Federalist Papers are themselves. But fundamentally, it's like the Federalist Papers kept coming up for a reason too. Tocqueville deeply admires them. Part of why I like Tocqueville so much is I think he and I have the same favorite Federalist paper, which is Federalist 39. And he basically says that America has this brilliant system that is the best parts of a federal government, where you have a sort of more sort of centralized thing that's collecting different parts, and the best parts of a national government, where the national government has basic authority. So he says, does this make sense in theory? No, it's crazy, but it actually works. And so, again, just to sort of reiterate the Federalist 39 argument, but this is a big part of Tocqueville's claim, he says, the American system allows the federal government to enforce its own laws. This is an innovation. Usually the federal government would ask like a state government to do something. He calls this, quote, his terms are bad, I apologize, but he says this is government centralization, where there's effectively clear lines of authority that the federal government can enforce its own laws. So that's great. He says the Americans have done a cool thing with this. But he says, at the same time, the federal government is limited in its scope and authority to a few powers. National defense, interstate commerce. So it can't micromanage citizens' lives. He calls that kind of micromanagement administrative centralization. He says that's bad, and the Americans don't do it. They don't let their federal government do very much. So he says this gives you a specialization of labor advantage. The feds get to concentrate on doing a few things really well, and the states do most things. They don't have to worry about fighting the federal government most of the time. And they also don't have to worry about getting invaded because the federal government takes care of that. And so he says he just deeply admires the way that the US Constitution divides power. At the same time, he's often quite critical of the performance of the states. He thinks that the states, their constitutions, especially their early constitutions at the founding, we've talked about the Pennsylvania one as everybody's favorite punching bag. He doesn't think they're as good as the federal constitution because they have too much direct democracy. The terms are too short. This has led some scholars to think Tocqueville is pessimistic about federalism. He's not. But again, that's for him because federalism's main advantage is in checking consolidated power, not necessarily in giving you like the optimal policy outcome in all results. Now, this is where Tocqueville gets really, I think, interesting on federalism, and then this will connect back to sort of set up Jackson. Tocqueville, again, deeply loves the idea of states' rights. He tilts more toward Jefferson or Madison in viewing the Union as a compact of states. So this is where he's more like the Federalist Papers and less like the Federalist Party and Alexander Hamilton. Okay. So like Madison and like Andrew Jackson, he thinks nullification. We've talked about that a few times. It's the idea that the states will unilaterally veto or block federal power. He thinks that is completely insane and it's antithetical to the Constitution. And he rails against John C. Calhoun and the others that had been kicking that around in the early 1830s, which again, Tocqueville's visiting America around the same time, a little afterward. So this is very much buzzing around. And so he does like Andrew Jackson for putting down nullification and saying unacceptable. I like states' rights, but this is not a way to do it. But one thing that's quite striking and where he actually breaks from Jackson a little bit, but not in the way people would think. And as I always used to tease my colleague, Zach German. Zach German's two heroes, we'll hear about him when he's talking, my former colleague who's now at University of Tennessee. I think his two heroes are Lincoln and Tocqueville. And they break on this because Tocqueville argues that even though nullification is unacceptable, you don't get to have a veto and stay in. Tocqueville thinks secession is constitutional, which is one of the things that Lincoln is hardline. Lincoln says, secession is unconstitutional. So Tocqueville says states' rights good. States' rights enforcement by secession is unfortunate, but maybe is your last resort. States' rights enforcement by nullification is bad. Jackson won't tolerate either nullification or secession. And so this is going to help sort of transition to thinking about Tocqueville because he's, again, floating around in Jacksonian America. One thing where he doesn't quibble with Jackson, which is interesting, the scholar Jeremy Bailey has noted this. Tocqueville doesn't spend much time discussing what powers Congress actually has. He says repeatedly they only have limited powers and this is wonderful, but does the interstate commerce power let you make a bank? As Bailey notes, this had been the main political constitutional fight for the last 40 years in America. Tocqueville alludes to the controversy, but doesn't say, actually, Jackson gets it right. The bank can't exist under federal power. Or, actually, Jackson gets it wrong. They clearly can. But just as an aside, too, I think that should also remind us how narrow the constitutional disagreement actually had been in America, even between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Can we build a bank with the commerce power? That's important, but that is not that ultimately significant. One application, one or two applications of the federal power. So Tocqueville is looking around at Jacksonian presidency now. Tocqueville says, if I look around at America, people want to be president. They get all fired up. They act stupid during election time. But he says at the end of the day, nobody really cares that much. No one's really going to risk their life or their treasure, he says, to be president. And this is interesting. He says, because look, the Constitution makes a weak federal government, and the president, properly understood, is a weak institution in the sense that its powers and scope are limited. It's supposed to enforce Congress's law. Foreign policy is a bracket, which I'll come back to. So he says it doesn't get to make policy. That's the states, mostly the Fed, the Congress in some cases. I always like telling my students, and they always their eyes bug out when I say Tocqueville says you're not going to fight that hard to be the president. But that's the rational thing to do when the president isn't that powerful. This is, again, one of the themes that we've talked about before in an era when the federal government has consolidated power and then Congress has handed power to the presidency. Maybe you're actually arguing it is rational to fight like a crazy person to get your paws on the scepter. So Tocqueville is seeing the very beginnings of that, not with Jackson claiming authority to make policy particularly, Jackson is claiming, and on these, I think he's probably right, frankly. Jackson says, I can enforce the Constitution myself. I'm not going to defy the Supreme Court. He gets accused of that. And this is one of my hobby horses. He doesn't defy the Supreme Court. But he does say, look, they made their case. I'm going to agree with them in that particular case, but I'm not bound by their reasoning. I can veto basically something is unconstitutional if they said it's constitutional. He doesn't say the reverse, that I can make something constitutionally blocked, right? But I can independently block it. But the thing that scares Tocqueville is that Jackson is starting to claim that the president is the representative of the American people. And Tocqueville thinks this makes him a demagogue because he's going to say, look, the American people are behind me, so get out of the way. Now, Jackson wants to do this in a negative sense. The American people are behind me in stopping these bad things the federal government is doing. Tocqueville, in fact, points out Jackson is not, despite what some critics say, someone aiming to establish a dictatorship in Washington or the presidency, or to act on behalf of popular pressure to have an active federal government usurping new power. In fact, Tocqueville says strikingly, Jackson wants to use presidential power to hand power back to the states. He calls him, quote, the agent of provincial jealousies who has, quote, decentralizing passions. Now, remember that in general, Tocqueville thinks that America and democracy tilts too much toward centralization. But looking around at Jacksonian America, he actually thinks that maybe the opposite is happening, maybe even too much of a good thing. So Tocqueville is less afraid of Jackson's legal and policy positions. Yeah, Jackson maybe tilts a little bit too much toward the states than he should. But as we've talked about, Tocqueville is generally on board with this orientation to the federal government. So in some ways, he's sympathetic to this, actually, and not all that critical on that front. But he does say that Jackson is a great threat to America because Jackson is positioning the presidency as sort of at the center of the American project. Right? This isn't because of optics. Tocqueville's travel journal actually has this funny meeting that he records from Jackson, and it's very matter of fact. His description is pretty subdued. He's almost impressed by how unimpressive Jackson presents himself in his White House. He has no guards or people hanging out in his court, so to speak. He's pretty much just hanging out in a room by himself reading when Tocqueville's escort brings him in. But Tocqueville does fear that the presidency will be an engine of direct democracy, or democracy sort of running amok, which again is one of his major themes of the book. Now, Tocqueville does recognize that the presidency will get stronger over the long haul because of foreign policy, which even strict constructionists of the Constitution think tends to be the place where the president has more authority than the domestic sphere. So as America gets more and more involved in foreign policy, which is almost by definition true since looking forward from the 1830s, the presidency by nature will get stronger. That's just an inevitability, he says. Again, I don't know if any of my colleagues, I hope one of them will talk about this more. If not, there's a line in Democracy in America that this is an aside from Jackson, but he literally says in the 1830s, the 20th century is going to be a war between Russia and America, with one representing central government and one representing liberty. And it's just baffling that in 1830, these are both basically backwaters. Real stuff's happening in Britain and in France. And he says, no, the 20th century is going to be the US and Russia as the two leading poles. I mean, there's some really wild predictions.
You have a crystal ball?
Yeah, there's some stuff he gets wrong, but
yeah.
He's not like a prophet literally handing down instructions from God, but he's really perceptive in seeing a lot of stuff like that. So, but he does recognize that that's part of him saying America's going to get more sucked into foreign policy. That will empower the president. And that'll look more like, in England and France. And as to Jackson, the man, Tocqueville is utterly contemptuous of him, although he does admire how Jackson handled Calhoun and nullification. At the same time, the paradox is the people that Tocqueville seems to be most influenced by in thinking about the Constitution, the guy he thanks the most in Democracy in America is Edward Livingston, who is Jackson's right-hand man. He's the guy who basically helps write Jackson's stuff, criticizing Calhoun. He's Jackson's basically, before he's in the cabinet, he's like Jackson's basically closest ally as a senator. And he talks to Justice McLean, this isn't in Democracy in America explicitly, but there are lines from McLean that are almost quoted exactly. But he does an interview with McLean that's in the travel journals. And McLean is someone who had been offered important cabinet posts: Secretary of War, Secretary of the Navy, by Jackson, but he turned them down. And so Jackson then appoints McLean to the Supreme Court. So Tocqueville is clearly someone who is very influenced by the thought of the Jacksonians and some of their leading thinkers. So I could sort of impishly suggest that in some ways Tocqueville is a Jacksonian who hates Jackson. That's overstating it a little bit, but at least there's a lot of overlap between the Jacksonian concern for federalism and Tocqueville's concern for federalism. Now, Tocqueville does have real worries about direct democracy, and that element of Jacksonian democracy does frighten him. So he's got this very, very weird relationship with Jackson. Probably worth pausing. This isn't Jackson per se, but Constitution. Tocqueville on the courts are also. This is where he is different from Jackson. Tocqueville deeply admires federal courts. He says every major issue in America ends up as a judicial issue. Again, which is really weird because this is even before the 14th Amendment has applied the Bill of Rights to the states and equal protection. He says, oh yeah, every issue ends up, because he says Americans are people who care about the Constitution, which is one of the things, again, he thinks checks democracy's worst excesses. So he loves the idea that the Supreme Court is this sort of thoughtful decision maker. And he points out and says, people thought at the beginning it was just going to be all team federal. No, they actually they side with the Fed sometimes. They side with the states other times. They seem like they're basically calling it pretty straight. So he admires that. He does have a line in Democracy in America that I think is really striking, where he's talking about what would happen if this goes wrong. And he says, federal judges must not only be good citizens, educated and upright men, but must also be statesmen who can sort of perceive politics pretty carefully. He says, look, the president can fail without the state suffering because the president has only a limited duty. Again, this is very alien to us today. A bad president causes real problems. He says, Congress can have problems without the union perishing. But he says, if the Supreme Court ever came to be composed of, and then again, think prophecy here, imprudent or corrupt men, the Confederation would have to fear anarchy or civil war. So he's calling out it. I mean, you could say he's predicting Roger Taney in the Dred Scott case, which is when Taney decides to say, hey, I'm imposing my slavery preferences, despite what the Constitution seems to say. Not too far afterwards, civil war follows. So that's another one I like to chalk up as Tocqueville's predictions. But again, Tocqueville fundamentally likes the idea of courts. He likes the idea of courts striking stuff down. And he makes an argument that sort of tracks along the lines that some originalists make about constitutionalism, which is he says, courts striking stuff down and enforcing things is not unfaithful to democracy, but it's faithful to it because it's enforcing the popular sovereignty that the people have endorsed in the Constitution. So again, Tocqueville is just deeply, deeply admiring of the Constitution for all the reasons we've been talking about, but that it divides power in a kind of theoretically messy way, but that actually the system, if followed, he thinks delivers basically the best of pretty much all worlds, even if you get a knucklehead like Andrew Jackson in there. But that's conditional on sort of constitutional fidelity, which, just again, going back to the last podcast, is why he thinks that sort of having a sort of civically thoughtful, educated people is just so utterly essential to making the system work. Because otherwise, you just get the sort of dumb, direct democracy that he fears will spin out into really heinous tyranny.
This is one of the reasons that we're doing the podcast, to make sure as many people can get this kind of education as possible. Dr. Beinberg, thank you again.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.